Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and today I'm going to be discussing which decade of science fiction was the best. Am I going to be writing anything with this pen? No, but research says holding one adds 40% credibility. Since starting this YouTube channel around 2.5 years ago, I've read well over 100 sci-fi books. So what I thought I would do is take the average score that I have given each of those, add them up for each decade in order to decide which decade was the best. For this particular video, I'm only going to be including books that I read since starting the channel, as I didn't want to have to retroactively give scores out of 10 to books that I read many years ago, so these rankings are going to be reflective of my current taste in sci-fi. And in this video, I'll be covering from the 1950s to the 2010s. I didn't want to include the 2020s as the decade isn't complete yet, and while I have read a number of pre-1950 sci-fi books, I thought that only 3 or 4 books per decade wasn't really enough in order to be able to accurately compare. So for each decade, I'll be sharing 1. What I think were the defining characteristics of the decade, 2. How many books I've read from that decade since starting the channel, 3. My average rating for those books, and 4. What was my favorite book from each of those decades. So let's get started with the 1950s. After the pulp magazine era of the 1920s and 30s came the 1940s and 50s, which would become known as the golden era of science fiction. Isaac Asimov said that the dropping of the atomic bomb made science fiction respectable to the general public, and that Robert Heinlein broke into the mainstream with short stories of his being published in the Saturday Evening Post in 1947. In a 2010 essay, writer Robert Silverberg claimed that the 1950s was the true golden era of science fiction, and that the 50s saw a spectacular outpouring of stories and novels that quickly surpassed both in quantity and quality the considerable achievement of the previous era. For me, the 1950s were defined by ideas-driven sci-fi, as exemplified by the Big Three: Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and Arthur C. Clarke. These books were less focused on the characters and plot, and more so on the ideas, the concepts, and the what-if questions. Since starting the channel, I've read 10 books that were published in the 1950s. The total number of books for the 1950s and 60s was a little less than I expected, perhaps because I'd already read a number of books from some of my favorite authors, such as Arthur C. Clarke and Kurt Vonnegut, before starting the channel. Of those 10 books, my average score for the 1950s was 7.50 out of 10. This is roughly what I would expect for any given decade, so I think the 1950s are in contention to win, but I'm not sure if that average is going to be enough to stand out. And out of those 10 books, my favorite was More Than Human by Theodore Sturgeon. I think it's a brilliant examination of what it means to be human, and perhaps where the evolution of humanity might be headed. Alright, up next we have the 1960s. The 1960s and 70s were referred to as the new wave of science fiction. This era of sci-fi incorporated elements of surrealism, as well as focusing on certain issues that were relevant at the time, including sexuality, drugs, and war. Arguably 3 of the most prominent writers of this time period included Frank Herbert, Philip K. Dick, and Ursula K. Le Guin. Since starting the channel, I've read 11 books from the 1960s, which is just a little less than the upcoming decades, so I might have to add some more 60s books to my TBR. Of those 11 books, my average score for the 1960s was 8.00 out of 10. This takes it into the lead over the 1950s. And of those 11 books, my favorite was Solaris by Stanislav Lem. It's an atmospheric and thought-provoking look at man's attempt to understand both the external and the internal. The 1970s continued the New Wave movement, focusing more on characters and sociology, and were influenced by events at the time following the Vietnam War. Some of the most influential writers from this period include Joe Haldeman, Larry Niven, and Frederick Pohl. Since starting the channel, I've read 15 books from the 1970s, which is the most so far. Of those 15 books, my average score for the 1970s was 7.53 out of 10, which narrowly beats the 1950s, but fails to take the lead from the 1960s. Out of those 15 books, my favorite was Dying Inside by Robert Silverberg. It's a rather bleak and impactful story about the loss of time and the loss of self. And just quickly, before we get into the 1980s, today's video is sponsored by no one. There is no sponsor because I keep turning them down. I don't want to waste your time promoting products I don't actually use. That doesn't mean there won't ever be a sponsor on the channel. I eat Greek yogurt every day. If my favorite yogurt brand reaches out to me, then I'll jump into a swimming pool of the stuff if they want me to. But until then, if you enjoy the channel, you want to support it, feel free to check out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs like Nima and New Eden, Half-Ogre, Zakawe, and the Golden Age Colin. The 1980s. As the New Wave movement passed, the 1980s took some of that character focus and infused it with digital tech, with one of the most popular subgenres becoming cyberpunk. And other subgenres still ended up including a lot of technology as well as dystopian elements. Some of the most influential writers of the 1980s included William Gibson, Orson Scott Card, and Octavia E. Butler. Since starting the channel, I read a total of 14 books from the 1980s, just one less than the 70s. And of those 14 books, my average rating was 7.04, which is the lowest so far. However, it was brought down by a couple of outliers. For example, I didn't love Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, and it's only partially science fiction. I describe it more as magical realism. So without a couple of outliers, the 1980s I think would be closer to the first 3 decades. And out of those 14 books from this decade, my favorite was Blood Music by Greg Bear. It's a great story about man's hubris and our relationship with science and the universe. Moving along, we have the 1990s. Themes that became prominent in the science fiction of the 1990s included the internet, biotech, nanotech, and the environment. Some of the highest selling writers from this era included Michael Crichton, Neil Stephenson, and Kim Stanley Robinson. Since starting the channel, I've read 16 books from the 1990s, just one more than the 1970s. And of those 16 books, my average rating was 7.91, which is enough for second place just behind the 1960s. Out of those 16 books, my favorite was Permutation City by Greg Egan. It's a hard sci-fi page-turner about a man's quest to create eternal life through a digital universe. And bringing us into the new century is the 2000s. The 2000s followed some of the same themes as the 1990s, as well as continuing to revitalize the subgenre of the space opera. Some of the prominent writers of the 2000s included Cixin Liu, Alastair Reynolds, and Peter F. Hamilton. Since starting the channel, I read 18 books from the 2000s, 2 more than from the 1990s. And for those 18 books, I give an average rating of 7.89 out of 10, just 0.02 behind the 1990s, leaving it in 3rd place. Out of those 18 books, my favorite was Redemption Arc by Alastair Reynolds, the second book in his Revelation Space series, and it's everything that I want in a hard sci-fi epic space opera. And lastly, we have the 2010s. When looking at science fiction from the 2010s, something that stands out to me is the pacing. This is a fast-paced era of science fiction, with the most emphasis on thrilling plots and storylines that lend themselves to film and TV adaptations. Some of the most successful writers of the 2010s included Andy Weir, James S.A. Corey, and Blake Crouch. Since starting the channel, I've read 26 books from the 2010s, which is definitely the most, although a large chunk of that is the Expanse series. If you take that out, then it would be a similar number to the 2000s. For those 26 books, my average rating was 7.88 out of 10, just 0.01 behind the 2000s and 0.03 behind the 1990s. Out of those 26 books, my favorite was Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. It's a hard sci-fi space opera with spiders, but also philosophy and empathy. So what is my verdict? As you can see, most of the decades are pretty close. I don't think there's a statistical difference really separating each of these decades. And what that says to me is there really was great sci-fi written in every decade. But if I had to pick a winner, I'm going with the 1960s. It had the highest average score, and it could have been even higher if it hadn't been brought down just a notch by Dragonflight, which is technically sci-fi, but wasn't to my personal taste. It also makes sense as my favorite writer Kurt Vonnegut was arguably in his peak in the 1960s, and he wasn't even included in these ratings as I read most of his books many years ago. I think what I like about the 1960s is the ideas-driven storylines combined with an experimental approach to characters and structure. So there you go, the 1960s are my winner. Let me know your favorite decade of science fiction in the comments. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button, and you can find more sci-fi content over here.